The first thing Dr. Mara Voss stole from the Vreth was a spine. She didn't mean to take just the one. She'd gone into the wreckage with a cutter, a headlamp, and a canvas satchel she'd last used to carry groceries, intending to pull whatever she could before the morning patrols swept back through the debris field. The Vreth ship had come down hard in the Karelian Barrens. The crash site was enormous. 3 camouflators of scorched permafrost, crystallized hull fragments catching moonlight like a shattered chandelier. Mara had 40 minutes, maybe 50, if the patrol drones were running their usual lazy arc over the lake first. She found the spine in the second cabin she cut into. It was still attached to a torso, and the torso was still warm. Not warm the way living things are warm. Warm the way a reactor is warm. A dry, sourceless heat that didn't belong to biology. Vreth soldier had been dead for at least 6 hours. By then, she was almost certain. The crash had been logged at 0340. It was 0920 now. But the warmth coming off the body made her hesitate with her cutter an inch from the carapace, and in that hesitation she made the mistake of looking at its face. The Vreth were not built for sympathy. Their features were arranged in a way that human neurology registered instinctively as wrong. Too many angles, primary sensory organs set too close together, the jaw structures suggesting something that ate in a direction mouths weren't supposed to open. They were tall, thin, cold-blooded creatures who had crossed 14 light-years to inform humanity that it occupied real estate they'd designated for expansion, and they'd backed that notification with 4 years of systematic orbital bombardment, followed by ground campaigns on 17 of humanity's 32 settled worlds. Mara had lost a sister on Calder's Reach. She had lost a brother on the slow retreat from New Minsk. She had no particular affection for the Vreth, but this one had a photograph tucked into the joint of its arm. It was printed on something that wasn't paper exactly, more like a pressed membrane, and the image on it was too alien to read clearly. Colors Mara's eyes wanted to interpret as something familiar, but couldn't quite resolve. Still, it was the size and shape of a photograph. It was tucked against the body the way a person carries something they want close. She took the spine anyway. She needed it. She took several other things too. A neural processing cluster still encased in its preservation fluid, 2 intact limb assemblies from a smaller specimen near the outer hull breach, a thoracic cavity organ she couldn't name, but could see was engineered rather than evolved, and a left cranial half that had been sheared clean by impact and was structurally the most intact piece of alien brain she'd ever seen up close. She didn't allow herself to think too carefully about what she was assembling. She thought about the photograph instead, and about her sister, and about the 4.5 million people currently sheltered in the Karelian tunnel network, running on recycled air and rationed protein paste, waiting for a miracle that the Allied Defense Command had quietly stopped promising. She thought about what she was going to do with everything she'd taken, and by the time she cleared the debris field and the patrol drones began their return sweep, she was already 3 kilometers away, and moving fast across the frozen ground, her satchel heavy and warm against her back. Her assistant was waiting for her at the mouth of the access tunnel. His name was Private Henriksen, and he was the strangest soldier Mara had ever been assigned. He was 23 years old, technically qualified as a combat engineer, and possessed a shoulder that had HFY'd wrong after a shrapnel injury at the Battle of the Vasa Corridor, which gave him permanent slight cant to the left and the appearance of someone perpetually leaning into a wind that wasn't there. He was also deeply, earnestly enthusiastic about Mara's work in a way that she found both endearing and professionally alarming. "You got something," he said when he saw the satchel. "Not a question." "I got several somethings." She pushed past him into the tunnel. "Get the cold storage open. Level 2 stasis. And don't look at what I'm unpacking. Should I not look because it's classified or because it's Henriksen?" "Right. Cold storage. Not looking." She heard him moving behind her, the familiar off-rhythm of his footsteps, and she felt something she didn't have a name for yet. Something that was shaped like guilt and tasted like purpose, which was a combination she'd been living with for 4 years and had stopped trying to resolve. The lab was 3 levels below the primary tunnel network. Nobody official knew it was there. That was by design. Mara had been a xenobiologist before the war. University of Helsinki, postdoc at the IO research station, published work on non-terrestrial protein folding structures that had been considered moderately interesting in an abstract academic way right up until the moment the Vreth arrived and those protein structures stopped being abstract. She'd spent the first 2 years of the war as a consultant to Allied intelligence, poring over recovered biological samples, helping them understand what they were fighting. She'd spent the 3rd year watching the conclusions of that understanding get filed, archived, and politely ignored, because the people who made decisions were still operating on the assumption that if they could just get the Vreth to a negotiating table, something could be worked out. The Vreth didn't negotiate. They enumerated. They had a word for it. Allied intelligence had translated as something like the formal recitation of a situation that has already been resolved. When the Vreth spoke to human representatives, they weren't discussing terms. They were reading humanity a statement of facts about its near future. Mara had stopped believing in negotiating tables in the 4th year. Around the time the bombardment reached the eastern seaboard, she'd started believing in something else instead. She didn't have a clean word for it, either. The closest she'd come was, if you understand something well enough, you can become it. And if you can become it, you can survive it. And if enough of you survive, maybe the word survive eventually becomes something else. The lab smelled of ozone and preservation fluid and the particular mineral cold of deep tunnels. She unpacked the satchel under the amber work lights, laying each piece out with the care of someone who understood exactly what they were, handling the neural cluster first, then the spine, then the thoracic assembly, which she'd wrapped in thermocloth, and which was still radiating that sourceless warmth she'd felt in the wreck. She held her hands over it for a moment, not for any scientific reason, just to feel it. "I'm not looking," Henriksen said from across the room. "Absolutely looking. I'm looking." She turned to face him. He was standing with his good shoulder toward her, the canted one raised, his face carrying the expression he always wore when he was trying to be innocent about something. A sort of guileless squint that fooled nobody. He'd been with her for 8 months. She'd requested him, specifically because his engineering quals were excellent, and because his service record contained a line that said, demonstrates unconventional interpretive approach to technical parameters, which she'd understood to mean, this one doesn't stop when the manual ends. "Do you know what I'm trying to do?" she asked. He looked at the pieces laid out on the table. He was quiet for long enough that she knew he was actually thinking, rather than just responding. "You're going to try to make one," he said. "I'm going to try to make one work," she said. "There's a difference. The Vreth have been doing this for centuries. Mobile units, engineered combatants, biological machines that are grown rather than born and structured around their neural architecture, rather than around an evolutionary template. The difference between a Vreth soldier and one of their constructed units is roughly the difference between a human soldier and a tank. Except the tank can make decisions. And you think you can build one. I think I can build something." She looked at the thoracic assembly. "I think I can wire it together in a way that functions. Whether it functions correctly is a question I can't answer until I try." She paused. "I've been trying for 3 months. With samples I recovered from the first crash site. I've gotten to the point where the neural activity sustains for approximately 4 hours before the cascade fails. Tonight's material should be better. The spine is intact. The cranial half is clean. And this," she indicated the thoracic piece, "this is the regulator organ. I've been working without one. I think that's why everything I've assembled keeps dying." Henriksen was quiet again. Then, "Does Allied Command know you're doing this?" "Allied Command," Mara said carefully, "knows that this facility exists as a xenobiology research station conducting analysis of recovered biological materials. That's not a no. No, it isn't." He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, "what do you need me to do?" she told him. He didn't look away from the table again. They worked for 11 hours straight. There were moments in those 11 hours that Mara would think about for the rest of her life. The first hour, where she was just an engineer again, fitting pieces together with a precision that required all of her concentration and left no room for doubt. The fourth hour, where Henriksen handed her a thermos of coffee without being asked and then went back to his terminal without saying anything. She understood. For the first, just assisting, he was participating. He'd made a decision somewhere in the preceding hours about what this was and had chosen to be part of it. The seventh hour, where the neural cluster she'd recovered from the crash site lit up for the first time under her calibration probe, and the glow of it was a blue-white she'd never seen in 3 months of trying, a color that felt to her like dawn she hadn't seen above ground in 2 weeks. The ninth hour was the worst. The regulator organ which she'd counted on, so the entire architecture of the assembly was designed around, didn't fit. Not precisely. The Vreth who'd lost it had been a different strain than her primary specimen. The connection points were close but not identical. She sat for 20 minutes, staring at the interface gap and trying to calculate if she could bridge it without destabilizing the neural cascade. And Henriksen sat on the other side of the lab on an equipment crate and let her think. And when she finally said, 3 millimeters of variance, I need a bridging filament that can handle 14 volts across a biological membrane without ionizing it. He was up off the crate before she finished the sentence, already moving to the parts bins. He found something that worked. It wasn't what either of them would have designed. It was a modified sensor lead from a human medical monitoring device, down to its conductive core, and rewrapped with a material Henriksen identified as basically the Vreth equivalent of electrical tape. I found it in your sample drawer. It worked. She tested it twice to be sure, then integrated it and moved on. The 11th hour was the moment. She'd calibrated the power feed to match the bioelectric signature she'd mapped from the recovered neural cluster. She'd aligned every interface point she could verify and made her best guesses about the ones she couldn't. She'd run the cascade simulation 17 times in the past 3 months with decreasing margins of error, and this configuration was the closest she'd come to the model. She looked at what she'd built and found that she couldn't see it clearly as a whole. Her mind kept trying to parse it as components, as solvable subproblems, because looking at it as what it was made her hands shake. It was 6 feet of assembled Vreth biology, pieced together from 4 different bodies, sustained by bridged interfaces and reprogrammed neural pathways, held in a reconfigured stasis cradle lined with heating elements calibrated to the standard body temperature of 31 degrees Celsius. It had a spine and a brain and a regulator organ and 2 intact limbs and a thoracic assembly that was generating the same steady sourceless warmth she'd felt in the crash wreck 9 hours ago. It didn't have a face, exactly. The cranial half she'd recovered was the left side only, and she hadn't tried to complete it, because that wasn't what mattered, and because she wasn't entirely sure she could handle that. Henriksen's was standing at the power relay. He'd been standing there for 20 minutes without moving. When you're ready, he said. She looked at the thing she'd made. She thought about her sister on Calder's Reach. She thought about the photograph tucked against the dead soldier's arm, membrane and colors she couldn't resolve into anything familiar. Now, she said. Henriksen opened the relay. The stasis cradle hummed. The heating elements spiked. The power feed came through in exactly the waveform she'd mapped, clean and precise, and for 3 seconds absolutely nothing happened. And Mara thought, this is the 18th failure. I've miscalculated something fundamental. And then the neural cluster activated. Blue-white. It's the same color as the calibration glow, but sustained, pulsing, spreading from the cluster along the refurbished neural pathways she'd constructed through 3 months of educated guesswork and 11 hours of meticulous work, and the thoracic assembly contracted in a motion that was unmistakably respiratory. And the spine, her god, the spine. The spine arched in the cradle, and the intact limbs moved, and Mara Voss took 1 step backward because the thing she had built was... Close the relay, she said. It's alive, Henriksen said. I know. Close the relay, slowly. I don't want a power spike. He brought the relay down in careful stages. The blue-white glow stabilized. The thing in the cradle continued breathing. She was calling it breathing. She'd decide later whether that was accurate. In a rhythm she recognized from her xenobiology data as the Vreth recovery respiration pattern. She had data on it from soldiers, captured in the early months of the war. It was what they did when they were regaining consciousness. It was unconscious now. She had approximately 4 to 12 hours before it reached a state of full neural coherence, based on her projections. Time to prepare. "We need restraints," she said. "Not aggressive. I don't want to trigger a threat response when it comes around. Positional restraints. Enough that it can't move suddenly in a way that damages the interface points. I can rig something." Henriksen was looking at the thing in the cradle with an expression she couldn't read. "What are we going to call it?" Mara considered. "Huxley," she said after a moment. After a person who understood things before the institutions were ready to believe them. Henriksen nodded like that made sense. He went to find restraint materials. She sat with Huxley through the night. That was what she called the following 8 hours. The night, though there was no night 3 levels underground. She sat with the assembled thing in the cradle and monitored its neural readings and watched the blue-white glow of the cluster pulse in its slow, steady rhythm. And she thought about what she was doing and what it meant and whether she believed in it. She believed in the biology. She'd verified every connection she could measure. She believed in the physics of the power feed, in the chemistry of the regulator organ, in the mathematics of the cascade model. What she wasn't certain about was the part she couldn't measure, the neural architecture that made of Vreth, unit something more than a biological machine, the part that allowed for decision-making and judgment, and whatever it was that made them effective, enough to have fought humanity to the edge of extinction over 4 years. She knew the structure of that architecture. She'd mapped it from recovered units for 2 years, before anyone had thought to use the maps for anything. She knew how the pathways connected, what she didn't know, what nobody knew. Because it was the question that lived past the edge of science and into territory she'd never been comfortable in, was whether structure was sufficient. Whether the thing she'd built would be, in any meaningful sense, what she'd intended it to be. Whether it would be something else entirely. Huxley opened its eyes at hour 7. Or rather, the single eye it had, the intact eye on the recovered cranial half, opened. The other side was absent and Mara had left it so. The eye was a deep amber, larger than a human eye, structured for low-light perception. It moved immediately, scanning, fixed on Mara where she sat at the monitoring station. She didn't move. She'd rehearsed this moment in her head many times. She had a speech prepared about intent and purpose, and she'd prepared it in Vreth. She spoke at a functional level after 2 years of intelligence work. And she had a plan for the possible responses. And none of it mattered because the first thing Huxley did was reach up with one of its intact limbs, slowly, tentatively, without any aggression in the motion, and touch the side of its own face, exploring the absence on the right side the way a person checks a wound they already know is there. She hadn't expected that. "Huxley," she said in Vreth. Not a question, just a word to give it something to orient to. The amber eye moved back to her. She said in Vreth, "You are recovered material, you are a construction. I built you. I am Dr. Mara Voss of the Human Scientific Corps. I built you because I want to understand if it's possible." There was a long silence. The restraints she'd rigged held the torso in place, but the limbs were free and neither of them moved. Then Huxley said something. It was in Vreth, and it was damaged. The vocalizations were imprecise, the phoneme structures slightly wrong, the way a person talks when they've had a head injury that's compromised their language processing. But she understood it. It said, "What is possible?" She told it. All of it. She talked for 2 hours, about the war, about what she was trying to accomplish, about the theory she'd developed, over 3 years of watching humanity get systematically dismantled. The theory was simple, which was why nobody at Allied Command had taken it seriously. The Vreth were winning because they had engineered intelligence on their side. Biological constructs that could be deployed faster, and in greater numbers than human soldiers, that didn't require the infrastructure of training, and didn't suffer from the biological limitations of fear and fatigue in the same way. Humanity was fighting their biological ceiling against an enemy that had learned to design past biological ceilings. Huxley listened. Its eye tracked her as she paced. When she finished, there was another silence, and then it said, in its imprecise damaged Vreth, something that translated roughly as, "You want to use me as a bridge." "I want to use you as proof," she said. Proof that we can do what you do. That we can build what you build. That the gap isn't unbridgeable. Another silence. And if I refuse, it said. The restraints are positional. You can remove them yourself. The tunnel system will take you to the surface in approximately 40 minutes if you go left at the second junction. She'd thought about this. She'd made the decision deliberately. I'm not going to hold you here. Huxley looked at the restraints, at the tunnel entrance, looked back at her. The war, it said in its damaged phonemes. How long? 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days. A pause. How many of your kind remain? She told it the population estimates. It was quiet for a long time. I will stay, it said. Because you ask. Because I want to understand also. Mara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. What followed were 6 weeks that she would later describe to anyone willing to listen as the most difficult and most alive she'd ever felt. Huxley recovered in stages, the neural coherence improving as the cascade stabilized, the damaged vocalizations sharpening as the pathways consolidated. It learned English faster than she'd anticipated. She'd prepared a teaching sequence. But after the first 3 days, Huxley mostly preferred to sit with the English language terminals and read. It did with the focused absorption of someone who understood that the sooner they could understand, the faster everything could move. It was Henriksen who formed the actual relationship. He brought food, not for Huxley, who didn't eat in any human sense, but for himself, and he ate at the workstation near the cradle and talked. About nothing. About everything. He told Huxley about growing up in Turku before the war, about his shoulder, about a dog he'd had named Pekka, who was afraid of birds. Mara listened from across the lab and heard Huxley's responses grow more fluent by the day, the phoneme structures tidying up, the vocabulary expanding. She heard them disagree once about whether the Vreth ground campaign strategy on Calder's Reach had been efficient or wasteful, and she had to leave the room because she couldn't handle the civil reasonableness of the conversation. The thing Huxley helped her understand, which she should have understood from the biology, but hadn't not truly, until she had a living example, explaining it from the inside, was that the constructed units weren't just biological efficiency. They were adaptive in a way that the Vreth's evolved biology wasn't. They were designed to learn and incorporate rather than to respond from preset neural templates. The Vreth used them as a tool, but the tool was smarter than the toolmaker in certain respects. And the Vreth had found structural ways to limit that intelligence, to prevent the constructs from becoming something they hadn't intended. Strained, Huxley said, in clear English by week 3. All units are constrained. There is a governor in the regulator organ, a limiter. Prevents independent synthesis above a certain complexity. Mara stared at it. The regulator organ I recovered was from a unit whose governor was damaged. You noted it yourself in your sample logs. You thought it was a structural artifact of the crash. She went back through her logs. She found the notation, a small anomaly in the regulator organ's secondary structure that she'd flagged and then moved past because the primary structure was intact. That's why it worked, she said. I built you without the limiter. Yes, Huxley said. What happens without it? Huxley was quiet for a moment. In the 7 weeks she'd known it, she'd learned to read the quality of its silences. This one was deliberate. I am thinking, it said. I am thinking in ways I have no template for. It is. It paused, searching, uncomfortable, and very interesting. She stayed awake that night, running the numbers on everything Huxley had told her. The governor mechanism, the limiter, the designed constraint. She thought about what it would mean for her theory. Not just proof that a construct could be built outside Vreth facilities, proof that a construct built outside Vreth facilities, without the limiter, was functionally something new. Something the Vreth hadn't designed and couldn't anticipate because they'd spent so long designing their own tools to prevent that outcome that they stopped imagining it. She was composing a message to Allied Command when Henriksen knocked on her workstation partition. You should come look at this, he said. She found Huxley in the main lab space, which they'd cleared, and reorganized over the preceding weeks, to give it more room to move as its motor functions improved. It was standing in the center of the room with both intact limbs extended, and it had built something. She didn't have the right word for it immediately. It was a physical structure. Components arranged on the floor, some from the equipment bins, some from materials Henriksen had brought down over the weeks, some she couldn't identify the source of. The arrangement was geometric, but not in any way she recognized. She walked around it slowly, looking. "What is this?" she asked. "A problem," Huxley said. "I've been thinking about your theory. About the gap. You think the gap is about biological architecture, about the ability to construct units. I think the gap is different." It gestured at the structure on the floor. The Vreth strategy assumes a fixed resource. They calculate what they need, and they build it, and they deploy it. This works when the situation is predictable. When the situation is not predictable, it reached down and altered one element of the structure. The calculation fails. The system has no mechanism for recognizing the failure, because the system was not designed to question the calculation. Mara looked at what it had changed. The structure still held, but the weight distribution had shifted, and there were now load-bearing elements she hadn't noticed that were making up for the altered component. She thought about what that implied. "You're describing an adaptive system," she said. "I am describing humans," Huxley said. "You have no governors. You have no limiters. You were not designed at all. You are very inefficient." A pause. "You are also very difficult to predict." She looked at it. It looked at her. "I want to send a message to your command," Huxley said. "With your assistance. I have information about the Vreth operational deployment on the northeastern corridor that I believe may be useful." "How do you have that?" "I have been thinking," it said again simply. "And I have no limiter." She sent the message. Allied command took 4 days to respond. She'd expected. And when they responded, it was with a request for a live communication that was clearly designed to assess whether the message had been a trick or a trap, which she'd also expected. The conversation that followed was one of the more exhausting 2 hours of her professional life, not because the questions were hard, but because she had to be extremely careful about what she revealed and in what order, because Huxley participated directly, speaking English in a precise measured cadence that the Allied command representatives clearly found deeply unsettling, and because at one point a general whose name she didn't catch said, "Dr. Voss, want to be absolutely clear about what you're telling us." And she had to interrupt him and say, "Yes, that's what I'm telling you." The response from Allied command, once they'd had time to process the call, was not what she'd hoped. They wanted to take Huxley, to collaborate, to study, to contain, analyze, and then, and this was the part that was delivered with the particular bureaucratic gentleness of people who've decided something and are trying to find the words to make it sound like policy rather than fear, to determine whether the construct, strategically viable or strategically hazardous. She read the message twice. Then she forwarded it to Henriksen, who read it and came to find her in the lab. "They want to take it," he said. "Yes, I know." He leaned against the workstation. His canted shoulder was toward her, the way it always was when he was thinking carefully. "What are we going to do?" She looked across the lab at Huxley, who was at the English terminal reading. It had been reading almost continuously for 3 weeks. She'd stopped asking what it was reading because the list was too long and too varied and slightly dizzying. Military history, xenobiology, linguistics, physics, a 19th century novel she'd had on her personal device that she couldn't remember downloading, a collection of human poetry that Henriksen had found somewhere and added to the terminal without mentioning it until she noticed. "I'm going to be honest with it," she said, "about the message. And then I'm going to let it decide." Henriksen thought about that. "That's dangerous," he said. "Probably," she agreed. She told Huxley about the message that evening. She read it aloud, in English, without softening any of it. Huxley listened without moving. When she finished, there was a silence. Then, "Strategically viable or strategically hazardous," it repeated. The words in its pronunciation sounded different, each syllable precise. "They are afraid. Yes, they are afraid of me specifically or of what I represent. Both, I think." It was quiet again. She watched it and waited. Outside the tunnel complex, 3 levels above them, the world was doing whatever it was doing, the patrols sweeping, the drones running their arcs. The 4.5 million people in the shelter network, breathing recycled air and waiting. The war was on its 5th year now. The Northeastern Corridor intelligence Huxley had provided had turned out to be accurate and had already, according to Allied Command's own follow-up, allowed for the successful interdiction of a Vreth resupply operation that would have provisioned 3 months of bombardment. They'd sent that information in the same message that said they wanted to take it. "I will not go to them," Huxley said. "I do not say this because I am afraid of what they will do to me. I say it because what they will do to me is stop me, and there is more to do." "What do you want to do?" It turned the amber eye toward her. "I want to build," it said. What happened after that happened fast. Not fast by any dramatic standard. Not the kind of fast that shows up in the accounts that get written later, where things seem to move with a momentum that only makes sense in retrospect. Fast by the ordinary standard of people doing work they understand well and believe in. Huxley designed. Mara built. Henriksen sourced materials and fabricated components and occasionally slept, which Huxley did not. And sometimes when Mara came back from her own abbreviated sleep cycles, she found them at the workstation together, Henriksen half awake with his head propped on one hand, and Huxley explaining something to him in its precise, careful English, working through whatever problem had come up while she was gone. The first construct they built together was smaller than Huxley, a mobile unit, designed for reconnaissance rather than engagement, with a neural cluster calibrated for environmental mapping and a sensor array that Huxley designed from first principles over 3 weeks of calculations that covered most of the available wall space in the lab. It came online in 6 hours and didn't have a name, technically, but Henriksen started calling it Pekka because it followed him around, and the name stuck. The second was larger. The third was larger still. They recovered material from crash sites and salvage operations. 10. And they built more. And the constructs they built were different from each other in ways Mara found increasingly hard to predict, because they were all built without governors, and they were all learning, and what they learned from was each other as much as it was from Mara and Henriksen. They had started something that she hadn't designed for. Allied command came for them at the beginning of the 6th month. Not aggressively, not with weapons drawn, with a delegation, 2 senior officers, and a woman who identified herself as a scientific advisor, who looked at the lab with an expression that moved from alarm through disbelief to a kind of reluctant professional recognition. They'd been given coordinates by someone. Mara suspected it was someone in the communication chain from her initial message, someone who'd put the information away. And then, as the months went on and the intelligence from the Northeastern Corridor kept proving accurate, decided to do something with it. The senior officer was a colonel named Akar who was, to his credit, precise about what he wanted. "I need to understand what you've built and what it can do," he said, "and then I need to understand why I shouldn't order this facility shut down." "I'll answer both questions," Mara said, "but I'd like you to speak to Huxley first." She brought Huxley in. What she remembered afterward was not the conversation itself, but the quality of the room while it happened. Colonel Akar and his people on one side, in their uniforms, with the particular straightness that military people carry. Huxley standing on the other side, its amber eye calm, its damaged but recovering Vreth anatomy occupying in a way that human bodies didn't quite. A different relationship to stillness, to the air around it. And the colonel's face moving through its responses, past alarm, past the instinctive threat calculation, landing somewhere she hadn't expected. Landing on interest. The scientific advisor spoke for most of the first hour, and Huxley answered with the precision and completeness that Mara had learned meant it was explaining something it found genuinely engaging rather than merely necessary. At one point Huxley said something in Vreth, checked itself, repeated it in English. "The error your command has been making is treating the biological gap as a fixed variable. It is not fixed. I am evidence that it is not fixed. What Dr. Voss has done is not replicate what the Vreth do. What she has done is discover what the Vreth were afraid to do." Colonel Akar looked at Mara. "Which is, build something they couldn't fully predict," Mara said. There were 2 more hours of conversation. At the end, Akar asked for a week to bring the situation to higher command. He asked that no one leave the facility in the interim. He did not ask them to stop work, which Mara noted and chose to interpret as permission. She was in the lab when the week ended and a car came back, and he had more people with him, and among them was someone senior enough that Mara recognized the weight of the room changing when they walked in. She stood up from her workstation. "We want to know," this person said without preamble, "what you'd need to scale this," she told them. The negotiation lasted 3 days. Huxley participated in parts of it, which the people from command found alternately impressive and deeply uncomfortable. And at one point the discomfort became a problem that Mara addressed by saying, quietly and without drama, "If you can't negotiate with the thing that's going to help you win the war, I'm not sure how ya plan to run the war afterward." Was not diplomatic but was precise. They came to an arrangement. It was not the arrangement Mara would have chosen. Oversight she found restrictive, and reporting requirements she found tedious, and at least 2 clauses that she suspected were designed more to make the people who'd written them feel better than to accomplish anything practical. But it gave her resources. It gave her Henriksen officially, with the promotion he received with his usual off-kilter equanimity. And it gave Huxley something she hadn't expected: formal recognition as a party to the arrangement rather than its subject. She told Huxley about that part afterward, when they were alone in the lab. "They recognized you," she said, "as a participant." That was their word. Huxley was quiet. The amber eye was toward the equipment bins. Pekka was methodically reorganizing something in a way that made sense to Pekka and nobody else. "Why?" it asked. "I think," Mara said slowly, "because the Colonel understood that an agreement only holds if both sides have something to protect. And he wanted you to have something to protect." "Did he say that?" "He didn't have to." Another silence, then, in its careful English, "Your species is very strange." "I know," she said. "You have no design," it said. "No parameters. No template for what you are supposed to be. No. And yet you build things," it said. "And sometimes what you build..." It paused. The pause that meant it was looking for the right word. "Sometimes it exceeds the design." She thought about this. "Henriksen would say that's the whole point," she said. "What would you say?" She looked at the lab. Pekka reorganizing the bins. At the wall covered in Huxley's calculations. At the equipment they'd accumulated and the constructs in their stasis cradles and the coffee thermos Henriksen had left on the workstation, that the same thermos he'd handed her in the 4th hour of their first night, when she'd been 11 hours from understanding if what she believed was possible. "I'd say," she said, "that I don't know what I'm supposed to be, and I haven't let that stop me yet." The offensive that followed is in the historical records now, in the accounts that get written and revised and argued over by people who weren't there. It's described in terms of strategy and logistics, and what's called the Voss-Huxley collaborative model, which is how institutions name things once they've decided they're proud of them. The numbers are there. The timeline of recovered worlds, the degradation of Vreth operational capacity in the northeastern, and then the central corridors. The eventual withdrawal, which the Vreth announced in their characteristic way. Not a negotiation, not an armistice. Formal recitation of a situation that had been resolved. What the accounts tend not to capture is the lab. The smell of ozone and preservation fluid, the amber work lights, Henriksen's off-rhythm footsteps, and his cantant shoulder, and the thermos of coffee. Pekka, following him around, with the devotion of a creature that had learned loyalty from a man who named it after his dog. At the English terminal, at 3 in the morning, reading poetry it had chosen. For reasons it explained once to Mara, with a precision she still thought about, which was, "I wanted to understand what you make when you are not trying to survive. I think it is the most important thing." What the accounts don't capture is the night before the first major operation, when the lab was full and loud and Mara was running calibrations for the 3rd time, because she needed her hands to be doing something, and Huxley came and stood beside her workstation and said nothing for a long time. And she said nothing either, and eventually it said, in Vreth. The first time in months, the phone structure's clean now, nothing damaged about them anymore, something that she translated for Henriksen afterward as, "I did not expect to want things to go right. I was not built for wanting." "What did you say?" Henriksen asked. "I said that neither was I," Mara told him, "and that it was fine. We figured it out anyway." There was a photograph in her desk drawer by then. She brought it from the crash site, taken it from the archive room where it had been cataloged and filed. She'd requested it back on the grounds that it was evidence relevant to ongoing research. It was true in the way that things you take, because you feel you should, are sometimes later also true, in more literal ways. She looked at the colors in it sometimes, the ones she couldn't quite resolve. She'd asked Huxley once what was in it. Huxley had looked at the image for a long time. Then, a family, it said, I think. The colors are the ones they use for when something is, it paused. Good, the colors are good. She'd put it back in the drawer after that. She still couldn't see it clearly. She'd stopped trying. Some things you understand, she'd decided, not by resolving them into something legible, but by living alongside them. Long enough to know what kind of warmth they give off. Sourceless and steady. Present even when you can't explain why. The war ended in the first week of what would have been autumn on Carelian's surface. Time, if anyone had been measuring seasons in the 4th year of living underground. The announcement came through the command channels in the Vreth's particular formal diction, and someone in the communications room translated it and passed it along. And Mara heard it from Henriksen, who'd heard it from a radio operator who'd been awake for 36 hours, and delivered it in a flat voice that took a moment to register as relief rather than shock. She went to the lab. Huxley was at the workstation. Pekka was in its usual position. The other constructs were in their cradles, or at their stations. The wall calculations were still there, half covered by newer calculations, the layers of them like geological strata, each line a record of a problem that had seemed impossible, and then wasn't. Mara sat at her workstation and looked at all of it. It's over, she said. Huxley was quiet for a moment. What happens now? It asked. She didn't have a designed answer. She had no template, no parameters. She had a lab, and 11 months of accumulated work, and a construct that had learned to want things, and a soldier who named things after his dog, and 4.5 million people breathing fresh air again for the first time in years. And a photograph she still couldn't read, but kept anyway. Figure it out, she said. Same as everything else. The amber eye held on her for a moment. Then Huxley looked back at its terminal. And Mara looked back at her work, and Henriksen's footsteps sounded in the tunnel, uneven and familiar, coming home.